The North Atlantic, December 1941. The waves crashed against the hull of HMS Hesperus with such force that seawater cascaded across her deck, freezing almost instantly in the bitter cold. Commander Donald McIntyre stood on the bridge, his knuckles white as he gripped the rail. Through the darkness and the spray, he saw it. A thin white line cutting through the black water, racing toward his ship at 45 knots. A torpedo. His executive officer shouted the warning, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Every instinct, every natural human impulse screamed at McIntyre to turn away, to run, to put distance between his ship and that deadly weapon. But he did the opposite. He spun the wheel hard over, turning the bow directly toward the approaching torpedo. His crew braced for impact, some closing their eyes, others gripping whatever they could find. The seconds stretched into eternity. And then, incredibly, the torpedo passed harmlessly down the length of the ship, missing by mere feet. The crew erupted in relieved shouts, but McIntyre's face remained grim. He knew this was just the beginning of a long night. This counterintuitive maneuver, turning toward death itself, would become one of the most important tactical innovations of the Second World War. It saved countless ships and thousands of lives. But understanding why it worked, and why captains were willing to bet everything on it, requires us to go back to the beginning, to understand the weapon that terrorized the seas, and the men who learned to dance with it. The torpedo in 1939 was perhaps the most feared weapon at sea. Unlike the massive guns of battleships that could be seen and heard, torpedoes struck silently, invisibly from below the waterline, where a ship was most vulnerable. They traveled underwater at speeds of 35 to 50 knots, propelled by compressed air or electric motors, carrying hundreds of pounds of high explosives. When they struck, they didn't just penetrate the hull, they created a massive gas bubble that could break a ship's back, literally snapping it in two. The mathematics of torpedo combat seemed brutally simple in those early days. A torpedo measured perhaps 20 inches in diameter and 20 feet in length. A destroyer measured 300 feet long and 30 feet wide. From the side, a destroyer presented an enormous target. From the bow or stern, it became a narrow sliver, difficult to hit. The logical response to a torpedo seemed obvious. Turn to present the smallest possible target. Run perpendicular to the torpedo's path. Get away as fast as possible. Naval doctrine in the 1930s reflected this thinking. Training manuals across the world's navies taught captains to turn away from torpedoes, to run, to evade. It made sense. It felt right. It appealed to every survival instinct bred into humanity over millions of years. When something dangerous approaches, you don't run toward it. You run away. But there was a problem, a fatal problem that took the lives of hundreds of sailors before someone understood what was happening, a problem rooted in physics, geometry, and the cold mathematics of relative motion. Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Wanklyn was one of the first to recognize it. A British submarine commander operating in the Mediterranean in early 1940, Wanklyn had fired dozens of torpedoes at enemy vessels. He noticed something troubling. When enemy ships turned to run from his torpedoes, presenting their sterns, his hit rate actually increased. It made no sense at first. The target profile was smaller. The torpedo should have been less likely to connect. Yet, time and again, ships that ran from his torpedoes seemed to sail directly into them. The revelation came to him one night as he studied his charts, plotting intercept courses. A torpedo travels at a fixed speed, let's say 45 knots. A destroyer at full speed might make 35 knots. If the destroyer is heading directly toward the torpedo, the closing speed is 80 knots. The torpedo crosses the danger zone in seconds. But if the destroyer turns and runs, presenting its stern, the closing speed drops to just 10 knots. The torpedo has 8 times longer to make course corrections, to be influenced by currents, to track the ship. And, critically, the ship has 8 times longer in the torpedo's engagement envelope. But there was more. much more. A torpedo's turning radius was limited. Most torpedoes of the era needed at least 100 yards to complete a turn. If a ship presented its bow and charged straight at a torpedo, the torpedo couldn't turn quickly enough to hit it. It would pass harmlessly alongside. But if a ship turned to run, moving in the same direction as the torpedo, even a slight angle adjustment by the torpedo could bring it onto a collision course. Wanklyn documented his observations, sending them up the chain of command. But institutional momentum is a powerful force. The Admiralty had taught evasive maneuvers for decades. Changing doctrine required more than one submarine commander's observations. It required proof written in salt water and steel. That proof came in the freezing waters off Norway in April 1940. The German invasion of Norway brought the Royal Navy's destroyer flotillas into direct confrontation with U-boats operating in the confined waters of the fjords. The destroyers had a mission to evacuate British troops and Norwegian refugees from Namsos, a small port town in central Norway. German U-boats knew they were coming. They positioned themselves in a deadly gauntlet along the approach routes. HMS Afridi was a tribal-class destroyer, one of the finest ships in the Royal Navy. Her captain, Commander Philip Vian, was a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen torpedo attacks before. On the afternoon of May 3, 1940, Afridi was evacuating troops when the lookout spotted torpedo tracks, 3 of them approaching from the port side. Vian followed doctrine. He ordered hard to starboard, turning to present the stern engines at full power. The ship heeled over as it made the turn, men scrambling to hold on. The crew watched the torpedo tracks with mounting horror. They seemed to be following the turn. The first torpedo struck Afridi amidships. The explosion threw men into the air like rag dolls. The ship's back broke instantly, the deck buckling upward in a grotesque V-shape. The second torpedo hit moments later, sealing her fate. Within 8 minutes, HMS Afridi slipped beneath the waves, taking with her 49 crew members and over 100 evacuees. Captain Vian survived, pulled from the freezing water by a fellow destroyer. He would never forget the sight of those torpedoes, seemingly drawn to his ship as he tried to flee. In the Mediterranean, another pattern was emerging. The island of Malta was under siege, and keeping it supplied required running convoys through submarine-infested waters. Destroyer captains noticed that ships following standard evasion doctrine were being lost at alarming rates. But occasionally, when a captain panicked or made an error and turned the wrong way, turning toward the torpedo instead of away, the ship survived. Commander Anthony Kimmins of HMS Maori witnessed one such incident in June 1940. A torpedo was spotted heading for HMS Nubian. The captain, in the chaos of battle, momentarily forgot his training and spun the wheel toward the threat. The crew, certain they were about to perish, watched in amazement as the torpedo passed down the port side with feet to spare. Kimmins made note of it in his report, but like Wanklyn's observations, it was filed away, an anomaly, an exception. The pattern repeated itself in the western approaches, in the North Sea, in the Bay of Biscay. Ships that turned toward torpedoes seemed to survive more often than ships that ran away. But institutional inertia is powerful, especially in wartime. Training takes time. New doctrine requires approval from senior officers, many of whom had learned the old ways decades earlier. Ships continued to follow the established procedures, and ships continued to go down. Then came Commander Donald McIntyre, the man we met at the beginning of our story. McIntyre was different from many naval officers of his generation. He had studied engineering before the war, and he understood mathematics and physics in a way that gave him insight into the geometry of naval combat. More importantly, he was willing to question established doctrine. In the winter of 1940, McIntyre took command of HMS Hesperus and was assigned to escort convoys in the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was intensifying. German U-boats were operating in wolf packs, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm convoy defenses. McIntyre studied every report he could find about torpedo attacks. He talked to submarine commanders when he had the chance, learning how they targeted their weapons. And he began to see the pattern. He conducted experiments, having his navigator calculate the geometry of different evasion scenarios. On paper, the mathematics were clear. Turning toward a torpedo reduced exposure time by a factor of 8 or more. It minimized the target profile not in width, but in time. It exploited the torpedo's inability to turn quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, but convincing his crew was another matter. McIntyre called a meeting of his officers in the wardroom. He laid out charts showing torpedo tracks, intercept angles, exposure times. His executive officer shook his head. "With respect, sir, it goes against everything we've been taught. Every instinct says to run from danger, not toward it." McIntyre nodded. "I know, and that instinct has gotten a lot of good men to the bottom of the ocean. I'm not ordering you to accept this blindly. I'm showing you the mathematics. The physics doesn't lie. The next time we face torpedoes, and we will face them, I'm turning toward them. You need to understand why, because your lives depend on it." That opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. Just 3 weeks later, Hesperus was escorting convoy HX-112 when U-boats struck at dusk. The attack came from multiple directions, a coordinated assault. McIntyre's radar operator called out contacts, surface vessels, probably submarines charging their batteries before diving to attack. McIntyre ordered depth charge patterns prepared and increased speed to investigate. Then the lookout's voice cut through the evening air. "Torpedo tracks, starboard bow, 200 yards." The bridge fell silent. Every man knew what standard doctrine dictated. "Turn to port, present the stern, run." But McIntyre's voice was calm and clear. "Hard to starboard, all ahead full. Steer directly for the tracks." The helmsman hesitated for just a fraction of a second before spinning the wheel. Hesperus leaned into the turn, her bow swinging toward the 2 white lines cutting through the darkening water. Men on deck watched in frozen horror, certain their captain had lost his mind. The torpedoes closed with terrifying speed. 100 yards, 50 yards, 25. McIntyre stood rigid on the bridge, watching the geometry resolve itself. The first torpedo passed down the port side, so close that men could have reached out and touched it. The second, aimed ahead of the first, crossed their bow by mere feet and continued on into the empty ocean beyond. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. The relief on the bridge was palpable, but McIntyre wasn't finished. He knew where those torpedoes had come from. He altered course slightly and drove straight toward the position where the U-boat had fired. His sonar operator got a contact almost immediately. McIntyre ordered a depth charge pattern, and the ocean erupted behind them. They didn't get that particular U-boat that night, but they forced it deep and away from the convoy. More importantly, Hesperus's crew had seen the new tactic work with their own eyes. Word spread quickly through the convoy escort group. Other captains asked McIntyre about what they had witnessed. He explained the mathematics, the geometry, the physics. Some were convinced, others remained skeptical. But the seed was planted. The real breakthrough came in March 1941 during the pursuit of the German battleship Bismarck. This wasn't about torpedoes fired at destroyers, but rather torpedoes fired by destroyers at the Bismarck. British destroyer captains needed to close within torpedo range of the most powerful warship afloat, knowing that Bismarck's massive guns could tear them apart. The conventional approach would have been to maintain distance, fire torpedoes at long range, and hope for a hit. But Captain Philip Vian, the same man who had survived the sinking of HMS Afridi, commanded the destroyer flotilla that made contact with Bismarck on the night of May 26th. Vian had learned his lesson in Norwegian waters. He understood that geometry and aggressive tactics could overcome raw firepower. His destroyers charged straight at the Bismarck, through mountainous seas and complete darkness, closing to point-blank range before launching their torpedoes. Bismarck's gunners, expecting long-range attacks, were caught off guard by the aggressive approach. The German battleship was forced to maneuver violently, disrupting her course and speed, making her an easier target for the heavy ships that would finish her the next morning. The aggressive tactics worked. Not all of Wien's torpedoes hit, but they didn't need to. They forced the Bismarck to react, to turn, to slow down. They proved that speed and aggression could overcome defensive firepower. The Admiralty took notice. In June 1941, the Admiralty issued new tactical guidance to the fleet. The language was careful, the recommendations provisional, but the message was clear. When facing torpedo attack from known bearings, captains were authorized to turn toward the threat rather than away from it. The doctrine was changing, slowly, cautiously, but it was changing. Not everyone embraced the new tactics immediately. Old habits die hard, especially when they're reinforced by years of training and the primal instinct for self-preservation. Some captains tried the maneuver half-heartedly, turning partly toward the threat, but not committing fully. These partial measures often failed. The geometry only worked with total commitment. You had to turn directly into the threat, presenting the narrowest possible profile, minimizing time in the danger zone. The Pacific Theater provided the ultimate proving ground for these tactics. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, their long-lance torpedoes proved to be the most lethal naval weapons in the world. Oxygen-powered, they could travel 20 miles at 50 knots, far exceeding the range and speed of American torpedoes. In the early battles around Guadalcanal, American destroyers were devastated by these weapons. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were lost, many to torpedo attacks. The survivors reported feeling helpless against the Japanese torpedo barrages, but American destroyer captains were quick learners. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger took command of Destroyer Squadron 12 in early 1943, and he drilled his captains relentlessly on aggressive torpedo defense. He had studied the reports from the Atlantic. He understood the mathematics. He knew that American destroyers couldn't match the range of the long lance, but they could use geometry and speed to their advantage. The Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943 proved the value of aggressive tactics. Moosbrugger's destroyers detected a Japanese supply convoy heading down the Slot, the narrow passage through the Solomon Islands. Instead of engaging at long range, Moosbrugger ordered a high-speed dash directly toward the enemy formation. When the Japanese destroyers fired their torpedoes, Moosbrugger's ships turned bow on, minimizing their profiles and closing the distance rapidly. The Japanese torpedoes passed harmlessly by as the American destroyers closed to point-blank range and launched their own torpedoes. 3 Japanese destroyers went down that night without a single American casualty. The tactics were spreading, evolving, being refined in the crucible of combat. Captains learned that the maneuver worked best when executed early. Wait too long, and you didn't have room to turn. React immediately, and you had time and space to present the minimal profile. They learned that speed was essential. A ship moving at 20 knots was twice as vulnerable as a ship at full power. They learned that crew training mattered enormously. A well-drilled crew could execute the turn in seconds. A poorly trained crew might hesitate, debate, delay, and those few seconds could mean the difference between survival and going to the bottom. But this story isn't just about tactics and geometry. It's about the men who had to execute these maneuvers, who had to suppress every natural instinct and charge toward danger. These were ordinary men, many of them barely out of their teens, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Seaman First Class Robert Davidson served aboard USS Fletcher in the South Pacific. He was 19 years old when he experienced his first torpedo attack. The lookout's warning came just after dawn, the sun barely risen over the Solomon Islands. 2 torpedo tracks approaching from the port quarter. The captain's order was immediate, hard to port. All ahead flank, steer toward the tracks. Davidson was on deck, part of a gun crew. He saw the white lines in the water, drawing closer with horrifying speed. I thought the skipper had lost his mind, he would later recall. Everyone was shouting. Some guys were crying. Others were praying. I just stood there frozen, watching death come at us. Then the ship leaned into the turn, really leaned over, and suddenly we were heading straight for them. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I go. I thought about my mom, my kid sister. Then the torpedoes passed us, one on each side, so close I could see the propellers spinning. It was over in seconds. The captain didn't say anything, didn't celebrate. He just ordered us back to station and went back to watching the horizon. But I saw his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. The psychological toll of these maneuvers cannot be overstated. These men weren't just following orders. They were actively suppressing their most basic survival instincts, trusting in mathematics and their captain's judgment over their own eyes and emotions. Some couldn't do it. There are reports of crew members freezing, refusing to follow orders, even attempting to jump overboard rather than face the oncoming torpedoes. These men weren't cowards. They were normal people pushed beyond what the human psyche was designed to handle. Captain Ernest Evans of USS Johnston understood this better than most. Evans was a Native American officer, a rarity in the 1940s Navy, who had worked his way up through the ranks through sheer competence and determination. When he took command of Johnston in 1943, he made it his mission to prepare his crew not just tactically, but psychologically for what they would face. Evans held regular drills, not just running through the mechanics of the turn, but talking through the fear. It's going to feel wrong, he told his crew. Every part of you is going to scream to run away. That's normal. That's human. But I need you to trust the mathematics. I need you to trust me. When I give the order to turn toward a torpedo, I'm not crazy, and I'm not trying to get us all eliminated. I'm trying to save our lives. Those words would be put to the ultimate test at the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. Johnston and her sister destroyers were screening escort carriers when they encountered the main Japanese battle fleet. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers, bore down on the tiny escort carriers. The American destroyers were outnumbered, outgunned, and vastly outmatched. Retreat was impossible. The escort carriers were too slow. Someone had to buy time. Evans didn't hesitate. He ordered Johnston to attack, charging directly at the Japanese battle line. His ship was hit repeatedly by shells from multiple Japanese vessels. The bridge was damaged. Evans was wounded, losing 2 fingers. But Johnston kept fighting, kept moving, kept turning toward danger instead of away from it. When Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes at point-blank range, Evans turned directly into them, presenting the narrowest profile, dodging between the tracks by mere yards. For nearly 3 hours, Johnston fought against impossible odds. She launched her torpedoes, scored hits with her guns, and, most importantly, she disrupted the Japanese formation, forcing them to maneuver, to hesitate, to break formation. The aggressive tactics, the willingness to charge toward danger, saved the escort carriers behind her. But there was only so much one destroyer could do against an entire battle fleet. Johnston finally succumbed to overwhelming fire in the early afternoon. As she went down, her remaining crew abandoned ship, and they witnessed something extraordinary. The Japanese destroyer that passed nearby rendered honors, her crew standing at attention, saluting the bravery they had witnessed. Evans went down with his ship, but his crew survived to tell the story of a captain who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is turn toward the danger, not away from it. The tactics that Evans and countless other destroyer captains employed weren't just about courage, though courage was certainly required. They were about understanding the mathematics of survival. A torpedo travels through water subject to drag, currents, and the limitations of its control surfaces. A ship, despite its size, can turn surprisingly quickly at full speed. The interaction between these two objects follows predictable physical laws. Understanding those laws, truly understanding them at an intuitive level, meant the difference between life and the depths. Commander Arleigh Burke, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, wrote extensively about torpedo tactics after the war. The key wasn't just the turn itself, he explained. It was understanding the entire engagement geometry. You had to know where the torpedo was fired from. You had to estimate its speed and heading. You had to calculate your turn rate and acceleration. You had to commit fully to the maneuver, no half measures. And you had to do all of this in seconds, often at night, often under fire, with incomplete information. The captains who excelled at this weren't necessarily the bravest or the most experienced. They were the ones who could process information quickly, who could visualize the geometry in their minds, who could make decisions while others were still trying to figure out what was happening. By late 1944, the tactics had become standard doctrine across the Allied navies. Training programs incorporated aggressive torpedo defense into their curricula. New destroyer captains were drilled on the maneuver until it became instinctive. The survival rates improved dramatically. Destroyers that would have been lost in 1942 survived similar encounters in 1944, not because the torpedoes were less deadly, but because the defenders understood how to fight them. The Germans, ironically, were slower to adopt these tactics than the Allies. German U-boat captains reported with frustration that Allied destroyers were becoming increasingly difficult to hit. Torpedoes that should have connected were missing. Ships were surviving attacks that should have been fatal. Some U-boat commanders attributed this to faulty torpedoes, and indeed, German torpedo reliability was an ongoing problem. But the real issue was that the prey had learned to hunt the hunter. In the final year of the war, as Allied forces closed in on Japan, destroyer actions became increasingly aggressive. American destroyer squadrons would deliberately seek out Japanese vessels, racing toward them at high speed, dodging torpedoes with practiced ease, and closing to point-blank range to deliver their own attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. The destroyers, once considered relatively easy targets, had become hunters themselves, feared and respected. After the war, naval analysts conducted comprehensive studies of torpedo combat. They analyzed thousands of engagement reports, calculating hit rates under different circumstances, measuring the effectiveness of various defensive maneuvers. The statistics were stark. In the first year of the war, Allied destroyers that turned away from torpedo attacks had a survival rate of approximately 43%. By the final year, destroyers that turned toward torpedo attacks had a survival rate exceeding 90%. The difference wasn't better armor or faster ships. It was understanding and tactics. The lessons learned in those desperate years of combat have endured. Modern naval doctrine still emphasizes aggressive maneuvering when facing torpedo threats. The weapons have changed. Modern torpedoes are wire-guided or autonomous, far more sophisticated than their World War II predecessors. But the fundamental physics remains the same: minimizing profile, reducing engagement time, exploiting the torpedo's limitations. These principles are as valid today as they were in the North Atlantic in 1941. There's a memorial in Portsmouth, England, that lists the names of Royal Navy sailors lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. It's a long wall, thousands of names, each representing a life cut short. Among those names are the crews of dozens of destroyers that went down in the early years of the war, before the tactics had been fully understood and disseminated. Ships like HMS Afridi lost because conventional wisdom said to turn away from torpedoes. Walking along that wall, reading those names, one cannot help but wonder how many of those men might have survived if the lessons had been learned sooner. But there's another side to that story. The captains who first turned toward torpedoes didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They didn't have statistical analysis or computer simulations. They had instinct, mathematics, and courage. They looked at the conventional wisdom and said, there must be a better way. They questioned doctrine, challenged assumptions, and were willing to bet their lives and the lives of their crews on their convictions. That kind of intellectual courage is as important as physical bravery, perhaps more so. The destroyer captains of World War II left us a legacy that extends beyond naval tactics. They taught us that sometimes the safe path, the conventional path, the path that feels right, is actually the most dangerous path of all. They showed us that survival sometimes requires doing the counterintuitive thing, the scary thing, the thing that goes against every instinct. They demonstrated that understanding the underlying mathematics and physics of a problem is more important than following established procedures. In our modern world, we face challenges that seem as daunting as a torpedo track bearing down on a destroyer. Climate change, pandemics, economic instability. The conventional approaches, the comfortable approaches, often make the problems worse. We need more people willing to turn toward the danger, to question established wisdom, to find solutions that work, even if they feel wrong. We need people who can suppress their fear long enough to do the mathematics, to understand the geometry of the problem, to make the hard choices. Commander McIntyre survived the war. He went on to write several books about his experiences, always emphasizing the importance of questioning assumptions and thinking critically under pressure. In one interview late in his life, he was asked about the moment he decided to turn toward that first torpedo. "I was terrified," he admitted, "absolutely terrified. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the compass. But I had done the calculations. I had studied the physics. I knew intellectually that turning toward the torpedo gave us the best chance of survival. The question was whether I could trust that knowledge over my instincts. In the end, it wasn't courage that made me do it. It was trust in mathematics, trust in the laws of physics. They don't care about fear or instinct. They just are." That trust saved his ship. It saved him, and it saved thousands of other sailors who served under captains brave enough to turn toward danger. The white lines cutting through dark water, the torpedoes racing toward their targets, became less fearsome as understanding grew, not because they were less deadly, but because the defenders had learned to dance with death. The final year of the war saw destroyer actions that would have been unthinkable in 1941. American destroyers off Okinawa deliberately positioned themselves between kamikaze aircraft and the fleet, turning toward the diving planes, presenting minimal profiles, and pouring fire upward. British destroyers in the English Channel raced through minefields to intercept German E-boats, trusting in speed and aggressive maneuvering to survive. Soviet destroyers in the Black Sea conducted close-range torpedo attacks on German positions, charging through defensive fire with tactics learned from their British allies. The confidence that came from understanding torpedo geometry extended to other aspects of naval combat. Captains who had learned to trust mathematics over instinct in one area began applying the same principles everywhere. Gunnery improved as captains learned to use calculus to predict target movement. Navigation became more precise as officers applied physics to understand how wind and current affected their vessels. Anti-submarine warfare evolved as commanders used probability theory to predict U-boat positions. The destroyer crews themselves changed over the course of the war. In 1941, the average destroyer crewman was young, often fresh from training, scared of the unknown. By 1945, the survivors were veterans, hardened by experience, confident in their ships and their tactics. They had seen the white tracks in the water too many times to count. They had felt their ships heel over as the captain ordered the turn toward danger. They had watched torpedoes pass within touching distance, close enough to see the rivets in the casings. And they had survived. But survival came at a cost. Even with improved tactics, destroyers were lost throughout the war. Some captains made errors in judgment, turning too late or at the wrong angle. Some crews panicked and failed to execute the maneuver properly. Some simply faced overwhelming odds, multiple torpedoes from multiple directions, making survival impossible regardless of tactics. The men who went down with these ships were no less brave, no less skilled than those who survived. They were, in many cases, simply unlucky. The randomness of survival in combat is something that haunted many veterans. Why did one ship survive an attack while another went down? Why did one torpedo miss by inches while another struck home? Skill and tactics improved the odds, but they couldn't eliminate chance. Good captains and well-trained crews still lost their lives. Poor captains and unprepared crews sometimes survived through sheer luck. The mathematics could predict probabilities, but each individual engagement was subject to countless variables, any of which could prove fatal. Yet the aggregate statistics don't lie. Over thousands of engagements across multiple theaters of war, the pattern was clear. Ships that employed aggressive defensive tactics survived at dramatically higher rates than ships that followed conventional evasion procedures. The tactics worked, not every time, but often enough to save thousands of lives. As we approach the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on what made the difference. It wasn't technology. Allied destroyers in 1945 weren't significantly more advanced than their 1941 counterparts. It wasn't numbers. In many engagements, Allied destroyers were outnumbered throughout the war. What changed was understanding of physics, geometry, probability, understanding of how torpedoes moved through water, how ships could maneuver, how to exploit the attacker's limitations. That understanding came at a terrible price. Ships lost, men who never came home, lessons learned through blood and salt water. But those lessons, once learned, were passed on. Training programs improved, tactics evolved. Each captain who successfully dodged a torpedo shared what they had learned. Each crew that survived taught the next crew what to watch for, how to react, when to commit to the turn. The community of destroyer captains became, in effect, a collective intelligence, learning and adapting faster than any individual could have done alone. When one captain discovered a new wrinkle in the tactics, word spread quickly through informal networks. When one crew perfected a particular aspect of the maneuver, other crews adopted and refined it. The tactics weren't static. They evolved continuously throughout the war, becoming more sophisticated, more nuanced, more effective. By war's end, the destroyers that had started as escorts, as defensive vessels meant to protect larger ships, had become hunters in their own right. They sought out enemy submarines, chased surface vessels, and fought with an aggressiveness that their pre-war designers never anticipated. The tactics that began as defensive measures, as ways to survive torpedo attacks, had evolved into offensive weapons, allowing destroyers to close with and destroy enemies that should have been able to keep them at bay. The legacy of those World War II destroyer captains lives on in modern naval doctrine. Every navy in the world studies their tactics. The principle of turning toward torpedoes is taught to every surface warfare officer. But more than the specific tactics, their legacy is about mindset, about questioning assumptions, about trusting in mathematics and physics over instinct and emotion, about having the courage to do the counterintuitive thing when the situation demands it. In a broader sense, their story is about human adaptability, about how people, when pushed to their limits, can overcome instinct and fear through understanding and training. The sailors who served on those destroyers were ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. They were scared, often confused, sometimes overwhelmed. But they learned, they adapted, they overcame. As the sun set on September 2, 1945, the day of Japan's formal surrender, destroyer crews around the world reflected on what they had endured. They had faced weapons designed to strike from invisibility, to destroy with terrible efficiency. They had learned to fight those weapons with geometry and speed, with aggressive tactics that defied common sense. They had turned toward death when every instinct screamed to run away, and they had survived. The white tracks in dark water, once symbols of terror, had become challenges to be met and overcome. The torpedoes, once seemingly unstoppable instruments of destruction, had been tamed through understanding and skill. The mathematical principles that governed their motion, once abstract theories, had become intimate knowledge, understood at a gut level by men who had bet their lives on those equations being correct. Today you can visit naval museums around the world and see preserved destroyers from that era. Walk their narrow passageways, stand on their bridges, look out at the water and imagine seeing those white tracks approaching. Try to imagine the courage it took to order a turn toward them instead of away. Try to imagine being part of a crew that had to execute that order, knowing that seconds separated survival from catastrophe. The ships are silent now. Museum pieces, carefully maintained reminders of a time when the fate of nations rested on the decisions of men like Commander McIntyre, Captain Evans, Commander Moosbrugger, and thousands of others whose names are less well known, but whose contributions were no less vital. The tactics they pioneered saved ships and lives. But more than that, they demonstrated a fundamental truth about human nature. We are capable of overcoming our deepest fears when we understand the underlying reality of what we face. That lesson, learned in the crucible of combat, in the desperate moments when torpedoes raced through dark water toward thin-hulled destroyers, remains relevant today. The specific threats have changed. We don't worry about torpedoes in our daily lives, but the principle remains. Sometimes the safe path is actually the most dangerous. Sometimes survival requires doing the counterintuitive thing. Sometimes we have to trust in understanding and mathematics over instinct and emotion. The destroyer captains who first turned toward torpedoes didn't know they were establishing a legacy that would endure for generations. They were simply trying to survive, to save their ships and their crews. But in doing so, they taught us something profound about courage, about adaptation, about the human capacity to learn and overcome. Their story, told now decades after the last torpedo was fired in anger during that war, remains a testament to what people can achieve when they refuse to accept that the conventional way is the only way. So the next time you face a challenge that seems insurmountable, when every instinct tells you to run, to avoid, to take the safe path, remember those destroyer captains. Remember the mathematics that showed a better way. Remember the courage it took to turn toward danger. And remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the path to survival runs straight toward the thing you fear most. Those white tracks in dark water taught us that. And the men who learned that lesson paid for it with their courage, their fear, and sometimes their lives. We owe them the debt of remembering not just that they fought, but how they fought and why their tactics worked. Because in remembering, we honor not just their sacrifice, but their intelligence, their adaptability, and their refusal to accept that the way things had always been done was the way things had to be done. The destroyers are museum pieces now. The captains who commanded them have passed into history. But the lesson they taught us remains as sharp and clear as those white lines cutting through dark water. Turn toward the danger. Trust the mathematics. Have the courage to do the counterintuitive thing. That's how you survive. That's how you win. That's the legacy of the destroyer captains who saved their ships by doing the one thing every instinct told them not to do. They turned toward the torpedoes, and in doing so, they turned the tide of the war at sea.